Hello, humans. I'm Kate O'Neill, and this is the Tech Humanist Show. We are a program dedicated to exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. Welcome back to the show. For those of you returning, welcome. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I know we have some folks out there who are tuning in, so give us a moment. We'll get you started. Here we go. How do the tools we use help us feel like we belong or like we don't? How do the systems around us reinforce our sense of connectedness or our sense of isolation? Our guest today has been looking at these issues across a lot of different lenses, really, really thoroughly, and it's going to be really cool. We're going to delve into just about all of that and more. This program, by the way, is brought to you by KO Insights, offering insights to help make the human experiences of the future more meaningful and hopefully create more belonging. This, as you may know, is a multimedia format program, which means that it's being broadcast where you're watching it, and it'll also live on as an archive across multiple channels so people can always find it later. Hello to those of you in the future from those of us in the past. And also, these interview shows develop into podcasts in the weeks to come, and we'll share more information about that as it's available. I hope you'll subscribe or follow wherever you're watching or listening so that you won't miss any new episodes. And now to introduce our guest. Today, we're joined by Vanessa Mason, who is a futurologist, writer, and researcher. She currently serves as the research director for the Institute for the Future's Vantage partnership, a network of future smart organizations that support strategic foresight research into the urgent futures that will shape the next decade across the business, social, and civic spheres. Her research and foresight work delivers and scales behaviors, products, services, technologies, and spaces with a focus on health and well-being. Vanessa has led work at the intersection of inclusive design, innovation, and health for global companies including Genentech, government entities including the City of Oakland, and the Brazilian Ministry of Health, startups such as Iodine, and pilot innovations funded by foundations including the Aetna Foundation. Vanessa has written for and been quoted in several media outlets including NPR and Fast Company. She's a frequent speaker and has been recognized as a 2018 Aspen Ideas Festival Spotlight Health Scholar, 40 Under 40 Tech Diversity Silicon Valley, 2016 New Leaders Council San Francisco Fellow. Sorry, I said that a little weird. 200 New Leaders Council San Francisco Fellow, and I don't know, maybe said that wrong. And as a 2016, I'll go get some clarity from Vanessa here in a moment. And as a 2016 TED Med Research Scholar. She serves on the American Heart Association's Social Impact Fund Investment Advisory Committee. Vanessa earned her BA in psychology from Yale University and her MPH in global health from Columbia University. She's also the author of Future of Belonging, a monthly newsletter that examines the changing nature of community and relationships in the 21st century and how technology can be redesigned to fulfill the basic human need for belonging over the next decade as loneliness, alienation, and exclusion become more pervasive. So audience, I know you're out there. I'm so glad you're tuning in. Keep getting some questions ready that you can ask live and we'll feature on the show since we are live for our outstanding guests. And so with that, please welcome Vanessa Mason. Vanessa, you are live on the Tech Humanist Show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so glad you could make it. You have been doing such fascinating work, and I'm so excited to connect with you. I will tell you, and I told you in email, and I'll just share with everyone who's watching, our team researching and prepping for this show, like, fell in love with you a bit, I think. You know, everybody's become such fans of you and your work. So it's a real honor to have you join us and really dig into your big themes.
Yeah, thanks. Love to.
Yeah, so let's start right with the Substack we just talked about, that the future of belonging. That introduction, which I read about examining, redesigning tools and remodeling approaches to fulfill the basic human need for belonging as loneliness, alienation, and exclusion become more pervasive. That seems like it's a big idea. It's a really broad idea. And it does seem like when I review what you've written, you have really explored so many dimensions of it. And so I see in your use of belonging as a lens on everything, my own use of meaning as a lens on everything. And I wonder, like, what is it about belonging that first attracted you to the subject in such a diverse and comprehensive way?
Sure. I think probably like many people who are curious about something, you start trying to think through how to find what you can't look for in your own life. So some of it started close to home, just sort of like, what does belonging mean? What does that look like? How do you know? And I think sort of secondarily to that, because I do work as a futurist in my day job, a lot of what our work involves is sort of combining what we'll call drivers. So these large scale kind of currents of change. If you imagine the ocean, like these are the ocean currents, and you're also looking at signals of change, the individual waves that, by themselves aren't necessarily important, but sort of point to ways in which things could be different. And so the belonging lens came to me because I was looking at drivers, like the fact that year after year, like the sort of the Cigna loneliness index, the sort of global measures of loneliness have only continued to go up. And it's consistent across, gender, it's consistent across age groups, that loneliness is increasing. And so I was like, well, that's kind of troubling that people feel alone even when they might be around other people, or they feel this sort of, what I thought was really remarkable is the last time I looked at this data was people feel a lack of quality relationships. It's not just the number, but the quality of those relationships. And then thinking about, if you've ever read like Putnam's Bowling Alone, he talks a lot about the sort of like the death of the social club in America, that you don't have, Elks and, all these other places where people, the community centers where people come together and spend time together. So this sort of disaffiliation from membership organizations, this general, I think, and we've seen in the pandemic, there's an acceleration of like people kind of decoupling from work in that sense, that's where the place, the club that they sort of spend time is not even the workplace anymore. And then this sort of growing sense of displacement, like I was thinking about this a lot, of course, in an American context around gentrification in neighborhoods, and then certainly climate change as more people are sort of forced to move. And then unfortunately now with the news with Ukraine and Russia, like certainly another like conflict driven kinds of displacement. And so I was looking at that, and I don't consider myself necessarily an optimist, but as a futurist, I was like, okay, well, if these are the forces that are sort of pulling us apart from each other, dividing us and separating us, this surely can't be the end of this. Humans throughout history have always found a way to come together, to sort of overcome and really, from my understanding, at least the superficial understanding at the turn of 2019 into 2020 was, if you think about a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there was this layer, of course, that is about belonging, that this is a need that everyone has. It's curious in the need that it's the sense that it's a need that everyone has, an individual need, but it's collectively fulfilled. And so I'm like, well, if it needs to be collectively fulfilled, if it's a need, how do we sort of look for ways in which people are sort of overcoming what these sort of headwinds that are looking at belonging? And so that was how I kind of got into that subject, was really from my own curiosity, thinking that this can't be it. And so the lens that I look at through belonging, I kind of sort of talk about these sort of three components of it, that it consists of the safety and comfort to be your authentic self. So that is inclusive of, do you know who you are, and are you comfortable being who you are? Do you feel safe being who you are? The sort of, another concentric circle, you think of emotional connections, all the relationships, the communities that we live in, who is around us that we feel like is witnessing who we are, that is validating who we are, that otherwise like allows ourselves to be seen and be with others. And then there's a larger sort of outside circle that's really around kind of narratives and culture, like where are the spaces, the context, the sort of vehicles for meaning and sense making, this crazy world that we live in. How are we constructing a story that says, where we are, what our purpose is, and what this is all meant to be for? So those are the sort of three components that I look at with belonging, which of course ends up being very large, but it does allow some, focus in on certain areas when you think about those sort of different layers of it.
I think we actually have that model here. Is that's exactly the one, right?
Describing, so a lot of it took a while, like writing and sort of backing into and sort of But yes, so that center layer is really around the sort of me, that safety and comfort piece of it, the middle, the networks and the communities around what relationships do you have, and then narrative and culture, certainly meaning and sense making spaces.
I love that. You gave us so much to dig into there with your answer so far. And I can tell like we probably need about 8-10 hours to really get into just the top layer of this discussion. One of the things I picked up that you said I really liked was about currents and waves, and, thinking about, sort of futurism and understanding trends and understanding, kind of overarching patterns in human culture. And it made me think of, I saw in one of your pieces on the belonging or the future of belonging. I'm like inverting words today. I don't know what's going on with that. I saw in one of your pieces about community. I think it was you were talking about, and you were talking about memes as a way of communicating. I saw even the pro-spiracy link, so conspiracies, but told in this a way that's right. Yeah. To affirm what is actually true through a conspiracy sort of lens. So it feels like that there's the cultural trend towards storytelling and community that feels like the current, and the pro-spiracy and some of these other things are the wave. Is that a fair way of understanding what you're talking about there?
Yeah. So we think about the waves as sort of these specific examples of something that might, show how things could be different. So I think there's a sort of overall current of, information now gets transmitted in memes, whether it's to poke fun at or to inform someone or to otherwise kind of sympathize with the state of the world. And then like specific sort of meme-like communication, like a prospiracy theory then is like a wave that sort of shows, okay, well, these don't always have to have about like having laughs or satire. Like they can serve a purpose. There's a utility in memes, because I think the overwhelming sense is that memes are just light, that they're frothy. I think what's interesting in the pandemic, there's a lot more research actually being done on memes, talking about the therapeutic value of memes, which I secretly love, because I think a lot of internet culture gets treated as it's silly. I've seen other people say this before, but anything that is done by young people, especially young teenage girls, instantly somehow is devalued in the sense of mainstream culture. But these things exist for a reason. That sort of pursuit of people feeling like that they're being heard, that they're not sort of suffering alone, that there's an ability to laugh through tragedy, to laugh through difficulty, are all very important human needs to fulfill. So I like anything that sort of, brings things back down to, what does it mean for the people who are involved in this, who are touched by whatever weird phenomena might be happening.
Yeah, that is brilliant. And also, I think we have a meme that we could share here that I think is really a wonderful example. I came into the studio before the show, and this was up in the studio, so I just felt like we needed to share that. We have a comment from a viewer, Spidergram. Hi, Spider. It's great to have you watching and joining in. He's asking, do you think that social media and other virtual connections have given people who would have been more traditionally alone greater connection among peers and with special interests? What do you think, Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the answer is yes. I think, with questions like this of like, is technology good or is it bad? Does it connect or does it disconnect? It's really not about an absolute answer, but I do think that people, given the space, and again, that sort of need to connect with people, they're clear on their purpose. And so, they say, I'm lonely, so I want to go find connections. And then two, they're also, they're open to the approach, and then they're also open to being vulnerable in that sort of context. And I do think that there's something about, for a lot of people, that virtual connections affords vulnerability. It obviously affords access because you don't have to travel. It's always on in that sense. And having a sort of renewed purpose by being cut off from the things that you might have considered to be connections before, that there's a push for you to do that.
And I think I wonder too about the balance of the relationships that are proximal, right? That those that are around us versus those that happen over distributed space and, online. And I think it's the assumption people have a lot of times is that the ones that are proximal to us are supposed to be the most important ones. But oftentimes it feels like the ones where we experience the most sense of belonging is in these distributed online communities. So how do you think about that balance, and how do you propose that we consider that balance?
Sure. I think, everything is about what you invest in it. And, that piece that I mentioned before around, loneliness isn't about the quantity of your relationships or even necessarily about where they geographically reside, but it is about the quality of those relationships. I certainly have much deeper proximate relationships that I had now because, my physical presence in between lockdown and the pandemic has been curtailed rather sharply. Like, I'm someone who used to travel for work once or twice a month. So sometimes I would see friends depending on where I was going for work. I would travel for vacations. I've traveled solo and met people. That has all has been reduced quite a bit. And so, for me, it was turning to, well, who's on my block? Who's in my neighborhood, who's a quick walk away. And so proximity can be a driver of close connections. That said, like, there's also curiosity. So part of the reason I started writing Future of Belonging was, I'm curious about this. I wonder if anyone else is curious about this. So I'm just going to put this out in the internet universe and see what happens. And it's been such a powerful way of connecting with people. But again, it's that sort of vulnerability and that curiosity that shows up. And so I think you can tend to both, but it's really just holding those two together in managing your relationships.
That's so good. And you spoke my truth. I mean, I normally am out traveling too, and it has been a very strange reality to be, more or less stuck at home, trying to embrace the stuck at homeness, but stuck at home for, more or less 2 years. With a little break in there where I did do some in-person speaking like last fall. And it was just like, someone has let me out of my cage. It's wonderful. But I, one of the other things you said about your block and getting to know the people around you really reminded me, shout out to my friend Bennett, who came up with this expression last year. It was I guess coming up on 2 years ago, right at the start of the pandemic. And he was talking about the way we think about mobilization and resources. And he said this phrase, feed the block first. Yeah. And it really just moved me so profoundly. And it's been connected for me to this ideology that I've been developing around the economy is people. And that, when we think about how to improve the economy, if we're not thinking about how to improve people's well-being, we're really not connecting to what fundamentally the economy is. But I just, you really provoked that reminder in me of the feed the block first. And so, yeah, there is this kind of strange duality. I mean, I'm a both and thinker and an integrative thinker, but there is this duality of like, I want to be back on the road. I want to experience those get-togethers in distant cities with friends and other places. And also, I did dig in and work on my neighborhood while I was here and became involved in a lot of things here in Hell's Kitchen in New York that I wouldn't otherwise have been involved in. And so I think, I'm just mirroring that back to you, I think is a really important point that you raise.
Yeah, I love how you articulated even that, feed the block first, and certainly the economy are people. I think, one of the most like disorienting things, and I kind of wrote about this somewhat, like this sort of loss of faith in humanity, that there is this assumption. And to be fair, I also want to contextualize this. I think this is a very American way of looking at things, that everything has a dollar figure tied to it. Everything is a transaction. Like, we don't have relationships as much anymore. We don't have this idea of like cultivating or stewarding or sort of this investment like over time. Like, think about all the business literature that came out like 10 or 15 years ago that was all about personal branding, like the little bit of weak ties where they would talk about, well, you just need to have a lot of weak ties, like add to your LinkedIn network. The more is the better. And I think this is where the sort of human comes back in, because it's not just about measuring sort of hubs and spokes and nodes. Do you really know that person? Do you trust that person? Do you like that person? Is there an affinity for that person? All of those things speak to qualitative experience of what it is like to be in the world, and things that can't be quantified in dollars and cents or counted in the sense of users and sort of percent of engagement. And so I do think that one of the good things I think that has come out of the pandemic is that sort of recentering of humans in all our activities, all our institutions, and all our systems, that they aren't just a bundle of processes, but that there are people behind them and people who are affected by them.
Yeah, and that it's all more nuanced than Dunbar's number, right? It's not just about the 150 connections that you can maintain or whatever it is, supposedly. Exactly. Right.
Although I don't even, now that I try to think about it, I'm like, do I maintain 150 connections truly?
Fair, right? Because you're talking about the real connection, the deep, true, meaningful connection, right? That you're actually remembering to text people and say, how'd that meeting go? Or, things like that, right?
Yeah.
I don't maintain that with 150 people, I'm pretty sure.
There's only so many group chats in the world.
Yeah. One of the other things that this is making me think of when we're talking about proximate or proximal or whatever, nearby relationships versus those that are more distant is some of your writing on belonging and embodiment. So our bodies and the physical sensations we feel in them. And you have written beautifully about this, by the way, but you wrote, I just want to quote one section. You said, our body is our first and last home. And I'm going to skip ahead to where you say, as we look at the technological shifts over the next decade and the physical and virtual spaces that our bodies inhabit, we have the opportunity to transcend, remix, and recreate our corporeal form in infinite ways that expand belonging. Beautiful, first of all. Would you like to expand on that thought for us?
Sure. I think that we've all experienced this to a certain extent, the sort of Brady Bunch life that we've been living for a long time, being in all of these boxes on Zoom, on Google Meet, here. And so that ability to be present, to feel, to literally feel another person and have some sort of mind share, sort of that experience of connection, certainly is a new way of experiencing our body and time and space, whether it's just the acute sensation, like I'm looking at myself now and like I'm inverted because I'm on a camera, which is a very weird way to experience your body with sort of that flip. But I also think of too, a lot of what I fall down these rabbit holes like a lot, and it's not to say that I haven't looked at this before, but like there are a lot of people with disabilities who have been influencers for some time, whether because they're patient advocates in healthcare or generally or like write about this on social media or social media influences for writing about the experience of living with a wide range of disabilities. So whether it's kind of neurodivergence, physical disabilities, or anything related to that, and just seeing and reading and learning more about their experience of the world and how much of one, the sort of notion of lockdown isn't new for them. Two, reading a lot about there were a number of folks who I read who were writing about tips, like basically, how to manage being physically disconnected in the world, whether because they either can't leave their house, it's difficult to leave their house, the sort of pace of their illnesses or their disabilities might have them feeling very positive and energized one day and really depleted the next. And it's just this, I think there's a wisdom in not having the sort of full experience in our body and like things that you learn and how you sort of view being human and participating in that. And then I also think that there are ways in which you can challenge like how your body works as well, that really pose new ways of learning and connecting with people. And then there's the whole universe of metaverse and ways in which people are taking on avatars and new ways of, becoming a purple spotted dragon rather than being a human. And what does it mean to experience like moving through any kind of world as a purple spotted dragon and what you're aware of. So those are the kind of the weird things that I think about in terms of bodies and ways in which we understand how our bodies work and what they're for.
Yeah, no, that's such a great observation too about what a difference it is to be a purple spotted dragon for that example, right? Like in those virtual worlds. And what does that tell us about our experiences in this world? Like, what does that suggest? I mean, what experiences have you had in the virtual space that have demonstrated that for you? What has brought that back for you to the physical world?
I will say that I haven't had as much experience in truly virtual worlds, like as much. Like I think I am somewhat, well, one, just from a logistical point of view, I get motion sickness a lot for whatever reason in virtual reality, but not in others. Like I'm someone as a kid who rode roller coasters all the time. Like I was flying all the time and had no issues with this. But there's something about the way in which you move through a visual world, at least as it's currently engineered, that causes motion sickness for me. It's also something I've read about is quite common. It's more common with women than it is with men. And I think it's something
I've read that too.
The spacing of the eyes or what's going on with the eye tracking. So that aside, I do think that there's something interesting in being able to move through a space and mimic how you would stand next to someone, how there's the sort of spatial audio side of it. And so you get the feeling of having a close conversation while overhearing another one. I think that's what kind of gets lost when we did all the Zoom cocktail parties and like the Zoom baby showers, is that it very much so is a one person speaking, so you wait, and then another person is speaking, so you wait. But our physical world in terms of our interactions isn't like that. There's always a certain level of crosstalk. There's, movement throughout. There's a sort of audio component of it. You're hearing snippets of conversation while you're also attending to the one in front of you. And so I do think that that level of realness and being able to like better feel proximity sort of enriches the interaction and certainly affects the nonverbal communication that you're taking in. So yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And it is you're describing it and I'm like, oh, that's what I miss. That's what I miss is like those nuances of the physical world, like what's going on, the complexity of what's going on around you that just adds to the sensory fulfillment of it in a sense, as opposed to this sort of stripped away, sort of tunnel vision experience of being on a box like this.
One of the most interesting things I've seen are people trying to recreate mass events in virtual spaces. So, all the concerts, a sporting event, something like that you could see. And I do think that you get some of the excitement, but there's something about feeling the vibration of everyone humming, singing, clapping, like all those sort of things that are just not captured in the same way in a virtual setting, that feeling of like shared humanity, basically, that comes from being in a physical shared space.
There's something to that. And I've never been able to find, I should ask my research team to help me find this, because I've never been able to find a scientific documentation of what this is. But I know profoundly that there is some way that we sense other people in ways that feel way too complicated to be true. Like when I was in college in Chicago in undergrad, there was a circuit of nightclubs that I used to go to with friends. And one of them was this one that was 3 stories of nightclubs. And we would be on the 3rd story of the nightclub. And it was this one particular night of the week in Chicago when it was a particular kind of music. And so you would tend to see some of the same people show up for that kind of music. But Dennis Rodman actually would come regularly to this club. And not that we cared, like we weren't particular fans. It was just that he was really famous. And he would come in on the bottom floor of the club. We'd be on the 3rd floor. And you could just tell that he was in the building because the energy changed. Like everybody got stood up a little taller and felt got a little, danced a little more intently. And there was just this sense now we're in the cool space because Dennis Rodman is here. And I have never been able to substantiate what that is, but I feel that there's something, very connected about human beings in all animals, probably in proximity to other animals, that we have such complex sensors for each other and such feelers up, right, for each other.
Yeah. And I think it's, I haven't fully been able to quantify. I think one of the experts that I quoted in that embodiment article, I believe his name is Dan Siegel. I think he's a neuroscience professor at UCLA. And he does talk about the way that we think about and construct the mind is really limited, that basically we think that the mind is about brain activity. And a lot of his research is sort of thinking about how our bodily movements and our perceptions of the bodily movements of others sort of create this kind of collective mind in a certain sense. And so it sort of challenges a lot of the ideas that we have around like our own individuality, like where our sense of self sort of begins and ends. And I certainly think like those anecdotes, like what you're sharing, like there was a vibe shift, like Dennis Rodman has entered the building. Like I went to go see years ago, like Oprah came to San Jose, and I remember being in the stadium and like everyone's excited, and then she's on the stage, and certainly it's like it felt like electric, like, which is wild. It's a stadium full of people, and then one person has entered and the whole place felt different. But I think that's part of being human. And I think it's something that we have been either underweighting or not really fully, maybe I think even feeling, maybe.
I think we just named this episode Vibe Shift, though. So that's cool. Like we just came up with that.
There's an article talking about that concept of a vibe shift because it's someone who tracks trends. So I can't fully
I know. It's been interesting discourse that's been happening around the vibe shift, right? Like everybody seems like they're kind of having this existential moment of, am I shifting with the vibe shift? Am I not shifting with them? Like, am I staying where I was culturally as opposed to, moving with the vibe shift? We have Spider is weighing in on interesting theories on how we may have different frequencies, which may govern things like vibe and our personal compatibility with other individuals. Interesting. Have you run across any of that, Vanessa?
Not distinctly. I mean, I'm sure if you talk to anyone on both the more like astrology, metaphysical side of things, they will tell you like there's this whole idea behind twin flames and like other things. I think it's somewhat, whether that's like the name that you're putting on it, I do think there's a lot of like biological reasons like why it might be like your eyes and your body are like picking up on signs from people all of the time. And so some of that sort of non-knowing, it just isn't passing through your conscious awareness. So I think the terminology matters a lot less, but like that's certainly a phenomenon that occurs.
Ooh, here's one. Madison Gephardt says, look into collective effervescence. That seems to be what you're describing. Definitely one of my favorite feelings. Very cool. We will look into that. Absolutely. Thank you, Madison.
I love effervescence.
Yeah. Collective effervescence is a fantastic term.
Yes.
Hey, I wanted to take you back a moment. There was a concept you dropped and we moved on, but I wanted to take you back because you mentioned about the virtual worlds and wearing the headsets and it being about motion sickness. And you said, which is something I've read too, that women tend to disproportionately experience that sense of motion sickness more than men do in general. And that I feel like ties really interestingly into something else you've written, which is in our increasingly algorithmic landscape, bureaucracy and culture, we can't escape how computation affects our bodies. And so it is clear that those virtual worlds were designed mostly by men, and women were probably not as much a part of the equation of designing and QAing and making sure that the worlds were fit, the goggles and experiences were fit for consumption by a wide variety of people with a wide variety of experiences. But I want to invite you to explore that topic too, and talk to us a little bit more about that increasingly algorithmic landscape and the tech sort of imposed experience of computation on our bodies.
Yes. I've been thinking about this a lot more lately in somewhat philosophical terms. So before I go into that, I will say definitely read the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez if you have not already. Her entire book is basically around the sort of R&D and data gap that exists around women in a lot of really weird and terrible, pernicious ways, like everything from how seatbelts are designed to what roads get shoveled. Like, I mean, she just has like countless examples of that. And so there's definitely, she's, from my perspective, the expert on this. But I will say, as I think about belonging and that sort of datafication and gender gap of it, I do focus a lot on, one, there's this sort of philosophical, if you look at like biological science, there's this sort of reductionist point of view. If we just sort of break things down into their component parts and we understand how the machine works, then we can fix the machine. On the other side of things is sort of, you think of more kind of like systems theory and in that all these things are interconnected. They're not really sort of, you can't sort of take apart one and like substitute the other. Like it doesn't really work that way, that there are sort of units, that there are bits, that there are ways of sort of quantifying everything. in how we work. And so when I think about datafication and technology and what's imposed on that, I do think that there's a lot of things that get missed by reducing things down to something that can be put into an algorithm. So that same sensation of collective effervescence, like there isn't a data stream necessarily that we could capture that would be able to recreate collective effervescence. Like certainly there's some signals that you could do, you could have the handsets of your Oculus could like tremor a lot more, so it could feel like you're in an actual stadium. Like there's some ways we could sort of somewhat weakly represent what some of those things are. But there is something to be said for human behavior and human experience is a combination of things that can be measured, and also keep in mind that things that are not just can be measured, but are easily measured, and then are sort of predicted on the basis of that combination of factors. And so there's a lot of things that either can't be measured, or there's a lot of things that are not easily measurable. And then there's, of course, a third step, like, can you recreate even like what you can measure, can somewhat easily measure? And so when I think about gender and what can be quantified, some of it is, that there are experiences of women that just aren't measured because like they aren't considered. There are some experiences being a woman that aren't easily measured. So I think every woman can relate to, you're walking down a dark street at night, the fear that you feel that someone either might pop out in front of you or suddenly run after you or something is something that is real. It's a real experience, but you can't really, there aren't necessarily ways to fully design for how you either account for that or how you sort of design around that. Like that is a felt sense, a felt experience, but by millions of women all over the world. But nonetheless, every time I've ever taken an Uber or Lyft, like no one ever accounts for that, to make sure, for example, that maybe the car always stops under a street light, that the car always has its flashers on, for example, so you're getting in the right vehicle. Like some of these are just protocols that would account for that experience that aren't accounted for. And then certainly things like the motion sickness could potentially be corrected for, but I don't know enough about the technology and eye tracking and things to know, can you really measure how women see and how those visual inputs then affect the physicality of like, what is your body interpreting from that such that it doesn't cause motion sickness? Like those are all technical questions that are beyond me, but certainly could fall into the category of that's not easily measurable. And then of course, what can you do about that? I think what I see from most technology sort of arenas and on thinking about gender and women is that it's sort of, well, we'll put it out there and then we'll fix it later. There's always this sort of we'll fix it later kind of paradigm to it. And I think in a lot of ways you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like I was unfortunately disappointed but not surprised, like seeing the news story of a woman who went into the metaverse and said she was groped within 60 seconds. Mm-hmm. It should not have been surprising. Like that has been happening in video games, unfortunately, for years. And should have been something that people should have known. But unfortunately, in this sense, the people were likely men who were designing this device and these experiences that just either don't think that's serious or they treat it like it's an aberration and not something that is common, unfortunately.
Yeah. Some of what we're talking about is also making me think about another area I wanted to explore with you, which is about belonging and experiences of people who are in a minority as it relates to the population or underrepresented. And it feels like belonging, because what you're talking about as with the virtual world and the motion sickness, but also it's reminding me of the conversation I had with Caitlin Ugalip-Phillips, who's the author of The Future of Feeling. And when her research into the approach that many scholars have taken or people have taken to using VR to try to simulate a sense of, or try to create a sense of, foster a sense of empathy in people, in the simulation of like a lived experience. Hey, like, let's say you're trying to see what it's like to be a purple spotted dragon, right? Like you can be a purple spotted dragon and then you go through this virtual world for a little while as a purple spotted dragon. And I think one of the things that she observed in her book and in this discussion was you're not a purple spotted dragon though. You walk away from that experience having had 15 minutes maybe of it, you don't have a lifetime of nuanced experience as a purple spotted dragon. And so you don't necessarily know what some of the dimensions of that experience are. And so I wanted to kind of take that back to belonging, because it feels like that nestles really interestingly under the topics of diversity and inclusion in the context of, the work of creating cultures of belonging. How do you propose that organizations and leaders, think about the reality of trying to help people understand dimensional experiences in the context of creating these cultures of belonging, knowing that we can't simulate it away. We have to create it through a sense of connected with each other and a true sense of empathy.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer.
Oh, sure.
But that aside, I think it's some of what I was bringing up earlier, that you have to. There's certain attitudes that you need to have with this work, and then that's one thing. The sort of the availability for curiosity, the availability for vulnerability. To really and truly do this work. The second thing is that I think, and this also might be both an American cultural thing, that we always want to sort of magic wand or science things away. Like, we want for a training to show up and then suddenly we're diverse. Like, it's great. Like, we've done our hours of training. Like, we've done micro employee surveys. So now we know for sure, if employees feel like they're okay here. There's a tendency to just want to have it go away. And again, that's the sort of the instant gratification, immediacy sort of things. But I also think it's the not practicing the vulnerability and curiosity that says, it took a long time for us to even be able to do this. I think, one of the exercises we do a lot in Futures, at least in our IFTF toolkit, we call look back to look forward. And ultimately it's about taking a group of people and visiting what are the sort of shared milestones, the innovations, behaviors, movements, whatever it is on a set topic with a huge group of people. So you could do a look back to look forward on the history of communication. You could do that on whatever your topic is. But the bottom line of what I'm thinking is that, our work environments with who was involved with it and how they were constructed is something that has been done over a long period of time. And the people who have been involved in that, who are not white men, who weren't already sort of property owners, already otherwise wealthy, is a really short timeline in the timeline of work. And so, all of this sort of work benefits from context and having shared context. And also, just as you're saying, what is that experience that people are coming in with? Even using my grandmother as an example, my grandmother had to go to college 300 miles away from where she lived, leaving behind her newborn daughter, who was my mother at the time, in Florida, because there were no There were no universities accepting Black students, rather. The only one she could go to was 300 miles away from Miami. And that is something that wouldn't happen today, obviously, but that's an experience from someone who I know, who's in my family. So, I think that we have to sort of keep in mind that history and that experience. I still bring that kind of experience in the workplace, that basically I'm in a workplace that was not designed for me. It's not meant for me to succeed. It's not meant for me to occupy the same sort of space and the same influence and to even feel socially as safe and as comfortable. There's a lot of research about psychological safety in teams. Our teams are not meant to be psychologically safe. They're set up to basically be office factories for us to churn out whatever it is that we are doing on an efficient manner, on an increasingly efficient manner. Productivity is off the charts, and then you receive a paycheck in between, for said efforts. And it's only really now, especially in the pandemic, that people are realizing that organizational culture has to be, well, one is created, and two, that there was an organizational created that people didn't realize that they were kind of unintentionally creating. And then three, if you want your organizational culture to be something other than what it is, you need to collectively decide and then implement that culture as well. And so all of those steps, again, require a sort of preconditions of vulnerability and curiosity, which people are unwilling to do at this point, or are really frightened to do. And they're trying to escape the sort of harder, longer work of negotiating for that to occur.
But I think you bring up such a really interesting and important point at this moment, as we're we're going through so many inflection points relative to work, right? Like the Great Resignation or whatever we're calling it today. We're talking about, the future of human jobs relative to automation and AI. There's the whole impact of the gig economy and the disruption of, I saw a number of times in your own writing about the sort of disruption of the career way of thinking about human employment. And so I wonder about, how do we think about creating the cultures of belonging in sort of hybrid work environments? How do we think about it when we're thinking about an organizational structure that is evolving, that is not what many of the managers and leaders in these organizations were trained to think about, as they came into the workplace? What are some ways that people can begin to think about this that are going to be more human empowering and belonging centric?
Yeah, I think that there's a few ways. One is taking a more critical view of how work is constructed. So I think that a lot of organizations and offices fundamentally are sort of command and control, kind of top-down hierarchies, unfortunately. The sort of, the manager does this, like, accountability only goes one direction. There's a low level of autonomy, generally, depending on what level you are in the chart. All of those serve to treat humans like widgets. And so what you can do is start thinking about, before you go run and do a reorg, because I realize that sounds like what I'm recommending, is really fundamentally listening, because organizations now generally do not listen. So more spaces at all hands for employees to share what their experience has been working at home, more experience to share what it is like to try to get to know coworkers, to try to do anything differently or move anything forward. Anything that really just surfaces people's opinions and experiences and allows themselves to be heard by everyone, I would say also too, not just, just have one team do that and then the senior leadership just sort of isn't involved in that at all. The sort of implementation of how you roll out that listening might vary depending on the scale of your organization, but start with listening. The second thing is to have some kind of spaces for shared imagination. So this could look like, all the sort of popular like team retreats that are out there, but you certainly could do this asynchronously. You could do this in an event. It could be as part of the celebrations. I think that people forget like little things that were happening in offices. Every month you might celebrate all the birthdays for that month. I think I just had a conversation with someone today that because of the pandemic, there's like these surreal things. I've had one of my coworkers last year had a baby, and it's weird seeing him now, like his child now one pop up on the screen. But it was one of those things like, okay, a human has arrived among us, which is a real feeling.
The smallest Tech Humanist.
Exactly. And so, I think celebrating things like, someone has had a child, someone has gotten married, someone has bought a house, like all of those things are core to recognizing the sort of pace and experience of human being human in this world that aren't just about work and productivity. So I think there's a way to sort of combine like celebration and imagination in a really good way. And I think that ideally that's a good combination. You don't like work is work, but it doesn't necessarily have to feel like work. You can find joy in work. You can find connection in work. You can find meaning in work. In an ideal world, like all of us would be able to feel that in our work. And so I think that start with listening, some spaces for imagination, celebration, and then some way of communicating how you're going to act upon what you're hearing and what people are imagining too. Is not just enough to surface all these things and then not do anything with them. I think there's a bias toward inaction in most organizations. And so, talking like that's something that certainly senior leadership should talk about, like, how do we think about making changes, knowing that we're going to surface some changes from this process? How do we think about staging them? How do we think about who's involved in them? How do we think about communicating about them, being transparent, being accountable, all of those sort of pieces that go along with good change management?
I love all of those. They're all very human constructs, right? Like listening, what could be more human and not automated than just, I mean, you can perform a listening campaign with automated systems, but to truly listen and take to heart what you hear, that is beautiful. And also the imagination. All of these topics, by the way, all you listeners and viewers, Vanessa has explored each one of the intersections between belonging and imagination, belonging and what was the celebration you have a piece on? Yeah. You see, I've done my research.
I didn't need to go back and read. I'm like, wow, it's been so long. Like timing is just.
No, they're wonderful. And I hope that everybody does go and read up on all that. We'll make sure to include links in the show notes to all of those articles. I wanted to ask you too, we're getting short on our time, and it's been such a wonderful conversation. I know we're slated for 8 hours, but I guess we're going to have to keep it to 1. I feel like one of the things that's so interesting about your background is your education is in global health, which has got to have been a fascinating lens to have viewed the last 2 years through.
Yes, fascinating is a good word.
Yeah, right. But also not just the last 2 years in terms of the pandemic, but the last several years and the imminent next few years in terms of many of the sort of changes that are happening in culture and society as a whole. When I think about the impact of technology on global health, and I think about a lot of the trade-offs that we are making, sometimes knowingly, like sometimes we realize we're trading our privacy, like, handing over some data so that we get more convenience or whatever. But in a lot of ways, it's more passive trade-offs, like we're being groomed for patterns and habits that are designed for us to consume. So we know that there are ways in which technology is harming our health and global health and our sense of belonging. But we also know that there are opportunities. So how do you think about that balance, that relationship, particularly at a global level, when you really think about the deployment of technology at a global scale? What comes to mind for you in terms of the balance of good and bad, the opportunities and risks that we're dealing with there?
Yes, I think, one, you brought up the notion of risk. So I do think, and obviously doctors are still grappling with this, the sort of beginning of the Hippocratic Oath, of course, is like, above all else, do no harm. And so I think still adopting that paradigm is increasingly going to be helpful, or both helpful and necessary as you look at global health. I do think that the notions of how we define harm are expanding because of technology. I think we still don't fully understand the harms that can result from data either being aggregated or used or leveraged by, depending on who the actor is and what they may be using it for. And so we need to work on expanding our notions and sort of understanding of what constitutes harm now. But I do think that when I look at technology and global health, there are a lot of opportunities to be able to serve massive needs in arenas or in countries and areas where health systems are not as deep and is not as resourced. And so, a lot of the things that technology affords are, yes, convenience, like for us, but it makes things faster, it makes things more, it can make things less expensive, and it can increase or sort of offer a different level of scale that maybe otherwise would be possible. All of those things are really helpful if you are a really cash-strapped country that does not have sufficient resources to serve the health needs of your people. So that those are all good things where sort of technology can offer some opportunity for better healthcare outcomes. I do think what has been a challenge when it comes to technology and what is limiting is, one, there's a certain level of kind of techno-utopianism that you see in a lot of different sectors, especially as like new financial players have gotten into global health who are from the tech sector. And sort of there have been some sort of basically famous failures or sort of investments that were far too soon to be born because there weren't the necessary infrastructure to be able to deploy or distribute those technological innovations. And so I think where the balance comes in is, don't design for, design with. because that will bring up where there might be gaps. Secondly, to expand your notion of harm. So again, another resource that Institute for the Future has, we have our ethical OS toolkit that folks who are developing technologies can sort of walk their way through 8 different risk zones to think about where there might be harms, where they may not be fully aware of those. So would definitely encourage that if you're trying to develop a certain technology. And then the third piece is again, like with everything else, like we shape technology and technology shapes us. And so not just deploying technology and saying, okay, we've built it, we're done, but really revisiting, okay, well, what do we need to change about this? Like basic things like malaria, for example, have changed and how malaria is treated because of the pandemic. And so, this might now be the time for a more technological distribution of how we might treat malaria rather than thinking about bed nets, because trying to physically distribute them now is challenging. So always reevaluate your context based on circumstances.
Yeah, it's you said some things in that answer that are going to be pull away quotes for sure. I expanding the understanding of harms or the framework for what harms are is going to be something really important, I think, for our listeners to take away and really sort of meditate on. The other thing I wanted to bring up in this context, thinking about global health and health in general, you talked about, you ended thinking about malaria, and in a way, I think the connection here is kind of metaphorical, but it's true. I saw on the Institute for the Future, there's an area where you deal with cognitive immunity and building a healthy cognitive immune system. And it feels to me like that's a really profoundly important topic right now. And it feels like, especially in this era of where democracy is being threatened in the US and around the world, understanding how to parse, the news and what we see online feels like a really important skill. I wonder if you would want to offer some thoughts on that. Just how can we think about building our healthy cognitive immune system as we consume social media for fun and pleasure? We're going to encounter misinformation, disinformation. We're going to encounter people who haven't expanded their understanding of harms in a proactive way, or they have expanded their definition of harms and they're actively trying to utilize them in a destructive way. How can we equip ourselves to build a healthy cognitive immune system?
Yes, I think in much the same way that you build a healthy immune system now. So, ideally, practicing some element of harm reduction. So if there are known sources, known voices that are spreading misinformation, disinformation, or even could be folks who are really quick to share news, like that's not necessarily verified. That's always sort of in the breaking news category, usually of which, breaking news ends up getting a lot of times will get corrected later, to sort of, tend to your media environment such that you are not in the harm of sort of pathogens in that sense. I think the strengthening comes from, identifying what are sources that are always, rather not always, sources of information that are trustworthy are often those that are clear about what their affiliation is, they're clear about what their motivation is, and that they are also clear about, here's how I arrived at my set of conclusions. If circumstances were to change, if I were to learn something new, then I would change my opinion. Like, you want someone who isn't selling you certainty, but is trying to offer you a way to think about something clearly. Usually folks who say that they are the only way, that this is the only option, that this is for sure the thing that is happening, are often motivated by something that is probably negative and will not necessarily serve you. So, in all of this, look for clarity. Don't necessarily look for certainty. And then lastly, build relationships with people where you can talk about this. Part of belonging is meaning and sense making. Like, if you aren't sure about something, or if it seems really provocative, you want to be able to talk that out with people and make sense of, like, what are the implications of this? How should we think about this? What can we decide? How might we reevaluate? Trust and knowing and liking and trusting people is so fundamental to just moving through this world.
Yeah. That's a really, really good takeaway. I've done some work lately on the future of trust and truth, and that feels like one of the themes that I keep coming back to. It's so important right now for us to have new lenses on trust. But I do want to come back to one last thought. We're at the top of our time, but with just one moment left, if you'll bear with me, you mentioned early on, you said, "I'm not an optimist, and you went on. But I actually, from reading you, I get the distinct impression that you actually do maintain a pretty high degree of hope about the future. And so I wonder, like, where does that come from? What is your source of hope? How do you think about hope and optimism? And I guess as a follow on to that, like, where would you like to see our efforts and resources most directed to align with where your sources of hope and optimism?"
Sure. This is an excellent question.
Thank you.
Where does my hope come from? I think some of it is history, that, humans have made some really awful mistakes before in the past, but we've found a way to move through, alongside, in spite of those. And so there's some element of that. I think the hope for the future comes, I've been reading a lot more about, from the, the organization name just escaped me, but there's another thinker called like Robin Kazarnik. I'm butchering his last name.
We'll look it up and link it in the bottom.
Yes. He talks about cathedral thinking. So I will offer that phrase to you, and I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but it's basically cathedral thinking involves this, every major cathedral that was built in the world was built over a very long period of time. Same with the pyramids, over the course of generations. And so having that sort of long range generational thinking, I try to think about, for the people who are coming 2 to 3 generations behind me, like, what is the world that, I can help lead them? And so that's like both a source of hope and also a motivation to say, things don't have to stay this way, that there's some movement that we can offer. And I think hopefully that's what other people see too, like thinking about the generations that are ahead of you. Like there's an example in Japan where they've done this, I think, in like their citizens assembly or something, like a democratic body, where they'll have their meeting and sort of deciding on policy, and then everyone will put on kind of jumpsuits, and then they're assigned roles of some sort of descendant in the future, and then they sort of relitigate all the policies like all over again. And the idea is to sort of put yourself in the place of the person experiencing the sort of fruit of what you have decided on before, because ultimately the future is the sum of the decisions we make today. And so I think if more of us thought about that, less about, what's going to happen to me 6 months from now, and more about, well, what is this going to mean for me, for my family, for the rest of the world, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, how might I decide things differently today? So hopefully that gives you a sense of agency, that you do play a role in the future, even if you can't quite see or feel what it is yet. Yeah.
That's perfect. What a great note to wrap on. I want to give you a moment to let folks know where they can find you and your work online.
Sure. I write at belonging.substack.com. Trying to get back into a more normal writing routine. It used to be more weekly, but I'm coming back. But yeah, join there, and I'll start adding, also starting to add some monthly events too, to have some shared visioning spaces for what we could see in belonging.
That's wonderful. What a fantastic discussion this has been. Thank you. Spider thanks you. I'm sure many of our guests are also thanking you right now. Vanessa, thank you so sincerely. What a wonderful, sharing, generous discussion this has been, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Had a great time.
Thank you. Well, thank you for listening to the Tech Humanist Show. If you're looking for more, you can find more information about our show's guests and other projects that they have going on at thetechhumanist.com. You can also find more episodes, plenty of great listening for your ear holes, or you can subscribe at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. So I'm Kate O'Neill. Join me again next time for more about how data and technology shape the human experience.